Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video, and today I'm going to be talking about some really long Victorian novels. Today I want to talk about some very big fat Victorian novels, which are long and huge and amazing. I have 14 books to talk to you about today, all of which are over 600 pages. I know that for like my prompt / challenge for Victober, I said under 250 and over 500, but there are actually quite a lot of Victorian books like between 500 and 600 pages, and I feel like 500 pages is not actually that long for a Victorian book. It's long for a modern book, so therefore it feels long when we're reading them, but in terms of like actual big Victorian books, I feel like 500 isn't that long, if you see what I mean. Like North and South is like just over 500 pages, and I don't think of that as a really long Victorian book. I think of that as a medium-length Victorian book. So I thought for this video I would recommend some extra long Victorian books, not just some slightly long Victorian books, and go for ones over 600 pages. And also because 14 books is quite enough, and we don't want to be here for hours. So let's go through these 14 books. Starting off with the first one, which is Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. This is 750 pages, and this is a great novel. It is a historical Victorian novel, so it's set in the 17th century in Devon, though it was written in the Victorian period, and it follows a man called John Reed and his kind of star-crossed lover relationship with a girl called Lorna. John's father was murdered when he was a boy by a member of the Doone family, but later on in life John ends up himself falling for one of the Doone family. It is very dramatic, quite violent and like adventurous too, but also with a great love story in it, and I would highly recommend it. Next I have The Woman in White by Wilkie. This is 672 pages. This is a sensation novel that follows various characters. We start with a young man who is an art teacher who, on his way to his new position, sees on the road a mysterious woman dressed in white. He goes on to become the teacher of two particular young women who we follow throughout a lot of the rest of this book, and things get very mysterious and complicated, as many a sensational novel does. It's dramatic and exciting. It so interestingly looks at the position of women in Victorian society and of the way the Victorian society looks at madness. It's really, really good. I would highly recommend it. I really need to reread it myself. Next up, I have several novels by Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens liked to write a long novel. A lot of his novels were over 600 pages. I'm not going to mention every single one that was, because I think there would be too many, but I'm just going to mention my favourite 5. One is David Copperfield. This is 882 pages, pretty long. As you can see, my edition is very hefty. David Copperfield is fantastic. We follow David Copperfield from his difficult childhood into his adulthood, as he finds a career and love and a place for himself in the world. He also becomes a writer. Like, there's so many interesting things going on in here. It's a fantastic book, so accessible, so enjoyable, and pretty big, but definitely worth the payoff. There's also Bleak House, which I've just finished rereading. Bleak House is pretty long. It's usually about 1,000 pages or more. I love Bleak House. It's fantastic. It tells the story of this court case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which has been going on for decades. There's a disputed will, and it's all very chaotic, and all of these people who might or might not inherit are kind of waiting for this court case to finally be resolved. And we follow all of these people who are kind of linked by Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Half the story is a third person present tense, and half the story is first person past tense, following a young woman called Esther, who is brought on as a companion to two young people who are wards of the court in the case of Jarndyce. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. So compelling, so exciting, such powerful stuff. So many great mysteries and twists in here, and such a brilliant central thread. I think it is amazing. Then there's also Little Dorrit, which is also usually about 1,000 pages, and Little Dorrit is amazing. It tells the story of Amy Dorrit, whose father is in debtor's prison and has been in debtor's prison for a very long time. Amy lives in debtor's prison with him. She was born there. She leaves the prison during the day to go out to work. She doesn't tell people where she lives, and then she goes back at night to the debtor's prison where her father is kept. And it follows her story and what happens with the various characters she meets around her. It is brilliant. It's a fantastic story about class and money and unrequited love, and Amy Dorrit is one of my favourite characters. She's so good, she's so interesting, and I would highly, highly recommend it. There is also Dombey and Son, which I love. This is usually about 900 pages, I think. It's a fantastic, fantastic book that I would highly, highly recommend. Dombey and Son is just so amazing. It tells the story of a man called Mr. Dombey. Mr. Dombey has a company. He also has a son and he has a daughter. And because he has a company, all he really cares about is his son. He wants his son to inherit his company, and he doesn't care about his daughter because the daughter can't inherit the company. And what are girls to Dombey and Son? And we follow Florence Dombey through her life, her relationship with her father and her brother and everyone around her. And like many of Dickens's really huge books, there are a lot of subplots and other things going on as well. And then of course there is my favourite Dickens book, Our Mutual Friend, which is pretty long. I think this edition is, minus the notes, is about 800 pages, so not quite as long as some of the other long Dickens books. This book sort of follows a fortune and all the people linked together by it. A man called old Mr. Harmon made his money in rubbish, in dust, and after his death, his money is due to go to his son, but on the son's journey back to England, he is found dead. And the book follows what happens to the money from then on and all of the people who are linked by it. I love this book a lot. It is my favourite novel ever. It is so wonderful. It is so well done. The characterisation in this is fantastic. The plots and the twists and turns in it are brilliant. I love the way this looks at class and gender and social issues during the Victorian period. I love the way it looks at money and respectability. This book has some of the best characters in all of Dickens in, and certainly has some of the best female characters in all of Dickens, and it's just an incredible book. And like, it's a big book, but there's so many plots in this that it needs to be the size it is, and it's so, so fantastic. Next on my list, I have 2 books by George Eliot. Some of you will know that I am not the biggest George Eliot fan. I don't super love her writing style, and there have been 1 or 2 books by her that I've read that I really didn't like. But there are 2 novels by her which I did enjoy and which I do really admire, both of which are quite long. One of them is Minimott. This is usually somewhere between 800 and 900 pages. It is a pretty hefty book, and it focuses on the town of Middlemarch and various people who live in and around the town. It is a lot to do with marriage. We follow various characters who end up in bad marriages that aren't quite working, as well as a lot of other things that are going on in the town and the kind of politics of the town. There is a lot to be said for Middlemarch. Like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of George Eliot's writing style, and I think her wry humour that I have heard people say is in her books goes very much over my head, and I do not get it at all. I much prefer the silly humour of Dickens, I won't lie. But Middlemarch is a really good book, and the way it looks at family life and marriage and small town life in the early 19th century is fascinating. The subtitle of Middlemarch is a study of provincial life, and as a study of 19th century provincial life, it really is interesting and worth a read. Though, like I say, Eliot is a bit of an acquired taste. If you don't enjoy it, don't worry, not everyone will. My favourite of George Eliot's books, the one I like the most, is in fact Daniel Deronda. This is usually about 800 pages, and this tells the story of a man called Daniel Deronda and also a woman called Gwendolen. Gwendolen, early on in the book, gets caught in a complicated situation, and Daniel and her kind of share a bond, but she is kind of off limits to him, and his kind of goodness kind of helps her become a better person in some ways. And meanwhile, Daniel meets a young woman called Mia, who is Jewish, and through her learns a lot more about Judaism and Jewish people in the 19th century, which he didn't know before. There is a lot that I really like about Daniel Deronda. Like I said, it's my favourite book by George Eliot. It's the only book of hers that I would say I really like. Middlemarch I admire and I respect, and I can see that she's doing a lot of fascinating things, and I find it really interesting, but I didn't really enjoy it either of the times that I've read it. But Daniel Deronda I did enjoy. I don't think it's perfect. I would have liked to spend a lot more time with Daniel rather than Gwendolen, but I think it's a really interesting book, and the way it looks at Judaism in the Victorian period is fascinating, and something that you don't find in very many other Victorian novels. I also think like Daniel as a character is really interesting, and the way that he kind of is a more moral person than Gwendolen, and the way that affects her is really interesting, especially because a lot of Victorian books feature kind of female characters who are really like moral and virtuous, uplifting and making more moral the men around them. Like that's a really, really common thing in Victorian literature, and I find it really interesting that in Daniel Deronda it's kind of the other way around. So yeah, definitely one that's worth a read. Next up I have Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is just under 700 pages. I love this book. This is one of my favourite books of all time. It's fantastic, it's so good. I would highly, highly recommend it. This follows a young woman called Molly Gibson, and what happens when her father, who has been a widow for a very long time, decides to remarry, and suddenly into Molly's household come a stepmother and a stepsister, and we follow Molly's relationship with them and also her relationship with a family who live nearby called the Hamleys. This book is amazing for many reasons. It's very powerful, it's got a beautiful love story, it really fascinatingly looks at unrequited love, it's got brilliant friendships in it. It also has like the most powerful, heart-wrenching, brilliantly accurate descriptions of grief I have ever read in any novel, and some of the most fully realised characters I have ever read in any novel. Squire Hamley. I just don't think there is any more 3D, fully fledged, completely psychologically believable character in any book that I have ever read. Like, if you want Victorian realism, go to Gaskell. Just go to Gaskell, read this book, it's so good. One thing I will say about this book, despite the fact that it's very long, it is slightly unfinished. Gaskell died before writing the final chapter of this, which means the ending of the book, it's very clear what's about to happen, that doesn't quite happen, which is a little bit sad when you read it, but you still know how it's going and it's okay. Like, the ending is basically there, it's just not quite finished, but it is fantastic and I would highly recommend it. It's just so good. Then I would also like to very much recommend The Egoist by George Meredith. It's about 600 pages and is a truly fantastic book. This tells the story of a man called Willoughby who is not very nice and is very self-centred. He is very much an egoist. And at the beginning of this book, he becomes engaged to a woman called Clara. But Clara, quite soon into their engagement, starts to think, I'm really not sure that I want to marry this man. And this book basically follows her trying to extract herself from that engagement and how hard that is in the Victorian period with like gender power dynamics at play. It is fantastic. Like, I love this book. I think this is one of the most interesting books I have read in terms of looking at Victorian gender roles and in terms of looking at power and gender in the Victorian period. Saying that, it is very inaccessible. I think this is the hardest Victorian book I have read in terms of the language. Like, it is not an easy, straightforward book. It's fantastic, but it is quite hard to read. This isn't for someone who hasn't read very much Victorian literature before. I think you should have read quite a lot of Victorian literature before you approach this. Like, reading this, some passages of it I found nearly as hard as reading Shakespeare, which I never find with Victorian literature. Like, Victorian literature I read a lot of and I read it very normally and I don't find it difficult. This book I found difficult. So go into it with a warning, but it is amazing and it's so good. Like, it's worth the payoff, but it's a very slow Victorian read. At 600 pages, it is shorter than quite a lot of the books I'm mentioning today, but it will take you longer because it is so dense, but I still really recommend it. It's so good. Next, I have some long Anthony Trollope books I would like to recommend you. So I'm not going to be recommending any of the long Anthony Trollope books that are part of his two series, the Palitzer books and the Barsetshire Chronicles, because those are all parts of series. But there are many long books in those series. However, I do have 3 of his standalone books to recommend to you. One is The Way We Live Now. This is about just under 800 pages and it's a really fantastic book. It follows what happens when this family called the Melmotts move into London from abroad. They have a lot of money, no one knows where they've got it from, but everyone wants to be their friend because they have a lot of money. And it basically follows all of the people around this family, including a particular family called the Carberries, who kind of get caught up in the Melmotte stuff, as well as a lot of other things going on. It has so many subplots, as you might be able to tell by the length of it. It really fantastically looks at money and wealth and respectability and class, and where money and class and respectability don't align and what that means. It's so good and I would highly recommend it. I would also highly recommend He Knew Who Was Right, which is another Anthony Trollope book. This one's longer, it's about 950 pages, but it is so good and so worth the length of it. I really want to reread it actually, because I haven't read it since I was a teenager, but it really stayed with me. It tells the story of a couple who marry early on in the book, and what happens when the husband starts to believe that his wife is having an affair. It is a fantastic look at a troubled marriage. It is brilliantly written, so powerful. Like, Trollope at his best. I think he explores bad marriages so well, but also like a bad marriage that shouldn't be bad because they love each other but they've just misunderstood each other and it's gone so messy and it's so fantastic and I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend Is He Poppinjoy, which is another Anthony Trollope book examining a bad marriage. This is about 650 pages. And we follow a young woman who gets married fairly early on in the book to a man that she likes, but she doesn't necessarily love. And over the course of the book, she kind of tries to love him, but at the same time there is a distance between them, especially when she starts spending too much time with another young man. It has some things in common with He Knew Who Was Right, and along with this main marriage plotline, we follow a kind of inheritance plotline. The title Is He Popenjoy refers to like a young little boy, and is he legitimate, and if he's legitimate then he should have the title Lord Popenjoy. I feel like I need to explain the title because it's so weird, but that's a great book too, and a very good Anthony Trollope book. Really accessible and enjoyable, long but worth it, with like such fantastic explorations of marriage. And then the final book I want to mention today, I think I've actually mentioned 15, not 14, I don't know how that happened, but there we go. The final book I want to mention is Eastland by Ellen Wood. This is just under 700 pages and is a fantastic Victorian sensational novel. We start at the beginning with various things, like within the first few chapters someone has died, leaving their child bankrupt. There's a murder that's happened before the book that we're all trying to solve, and that the person who has been accused of the murder has like run away from town. His father believes he did it, but his sister doesn't. Like, it gets all very dramatic and exciting. There is so much drama in this book. Death and murder, disguises, deception, seductions, like so much stuff happening. It is fantastic. It is brilliantly written, really wonderfully done, and like the central female characters in this are so powerful. I think this is a fantastic book, would highly recommend. So there we have it. Those are 15 big Victorian novels that I would highly recommend. Please let me know down in the comments if you'd like to recommend any big Victorian books, and tell me as well what your favourite big Victorian book is. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.